Can I just, in prefacing my questions to you, can I just say how much I know I appreciated when I was in the European Parliament, and I think Britain has done extremely well out of having you in Europol.
Thank you.
And you've always been extremely positive and helpful, and I think putting across the right sort of approach in the dealings that certainly I had with you and others had with you in the European Parliament. So I think that's something I always remember. But of course I want to look now at the issue about the statement the government has made that in future it is important to have the closest possible cooperation between the UK and the other European countries post-Brexit. And I'm looking at that in the context of two things. One is your evidence that you gave a year ago to the House of Commons Committee, I think to the day, and also to the new regulation of Europol, which came into effect in May last year, and which you referred to in your evidence as having some effect on the nature of that future cooperation. Can you elaborate slightly on how one could achieve this closest possible cooperation? What would be the elements in it? What would be the characteristics? Would we need some separate treaty? Or how do you actually see this looking ahead?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind remarks, and I always valued our relationship when you were in the European Parliament. Well, look, in the ideal world, I think there would be no change to the current arrangements that the UK has. And I say that because we, as a community of security partners in Europe and the European Union, have worked very hard over the last 3 decades, as you know, to build a very closely integrated model of police cooperation. It's as close and as effective as you'll see anywhere in the world, across any region. And the reality is that the United Kingdom has been a significant driver in that process over the last 30 years and has been in the front line of investing considerable intellectual resources, but also actual resources in terms of information and operational capabilities. So, as much as possible through this process, we need to preserve fully the benefits of what that means for the United Kingdom and the rest of the EU. That's the ideal world. I think it's not realistic. It's pretty clear that the Commission has said already clearly there has to be some difference in the status of EU members and those that are not. So one can assume, therefore, although I'm not party to the negotiations, that the Commission will somehow insist on some change. That is most likely, I think, to be felt in the level of strategic influence, at least directly, that the UK will have in the future. So the analogy is that it will be sitting at fewer tables, or at least in a less prominent role, less able, therefore, to drive the bus that it has been doing over the last few years. I don't think we should underestimate the level of indirect influence the UK can still enjoy through its very close partnerships around Europe. But there will clearly be some change in formal status, and that would be felt, I think, in levels of strategic influence. But for me, the most important element here is that we preserve as much as possible the operational cooperation that the UK law enforcement services have with their partners through EU mechanisms. So in the key mechanisms of Europol, Eurojust, European Arrest Warrant, Schengen Information System, and perhaps the Criminal Record Information System, across those and maybe one or two others, these are essential tools for how law enforcement agencies in the United Kingdom does its everyday business, and an essential part of the way in which the UK and the EU have formed this extremely symbiotic and close relationship. Now, so how does closest possible cooperation look like? Well, there are different models, of course. You have this special agreement, which we might discuss later, that Denmark now enjoys with Europol, but that doesn't really apply because Denmark is still an EU member state. Norway and Switzerland are close colleagues, close partners in the EU security framework, but of course they're Schengen states. The United States, as I said, especially in the last 3 years, has really grown its interface with the EU. But even that is dwarfed in scale compared to what the UK does today. If we take the our experience at Europol, 5 times as much information is exchanged between the United Kingdom and Europol than that of the US. And the US is already a big partner. And it gives you a sense of the scale of operation that we have and the way in which the UK is today in the top 3 of those member states that are really investing so much. So what is essential is that, as I said, is that we preserve as much of that operational cooperation as possible, and the exact modalities, I'm afraid, I'm not directly influencing, and I can't possibly predict.
Well, you mentioned just the scale. What I'm rather more interested in than the scale, because the argument can be that, you know, we have more that people want than they've got that we want, and therefore they're bound to do a deal. What I'm interested in a way is the quality of the information that is exchanged and the speed at which the information is exchanged. And that's one of my concerns, and I just wonder whether that would inevitably be affected on a post-Brexit basis without something very specific in place.
Well, in the context of Europol, certainly what is likely to be a significant issue through the negotiations, and depending on what they result in the implementation of them, is the fact that currently no non-EU member states have direct access to our databases.
Yeah.
I think that's the point that you were making.
Yes.
And if that doesn't change, then that is that of course can be an impediment to speed and quality of service and exchange. But even in that area, there is a significant issue for Europol to absorb the significant resource burden that would come with acting as the sort of gateway, as it does at the moment for Norway, Switzerland, for example, for the UK, when the volumes are so much higher. That places an enormous resource burden on Europol. So, you know, there are interests on both sides here that I'm sure the European Commission will also take account of as well. Beyond that, of course, there are the rather obvious challenges ahead of keeping the United Kingdom engaged in those other instruments of police cooperation that I mentioned. The fact that there are currently no non-EU member states that are accessing the European Arrest Warrant. There are no non-EU, non-Schengen states that are accessing the Schengen Information System. So for the UK to continue to rely on what are, as I said, essential police instruments, then a precedent would have to be found, which is always possible in politics, as all of you know.
Yes, indeed.
But that's the position that we're in.
Are you concerned that the UK will lose influence by not having chairmanships of committees or influence in committees, as it has had, significantly? And will it matter?
The answer is, I think it will lose influence, and yes, it does matter. Today, we have the situation where the United Kingdom is the lead member state in a number of important projects that are coordinating the activities of many member states and Europol and others. So in the field of modern slavery, which is close to the Prime Minister's heart, as you know, amongst others, in terms of combating certain forms of large-scale fraud, cocaine trafficking, the UK is in the driving seat for coordinating highly complex, large-scale, multinational operations. It is currently, the United Kingdom is currently the chairman of the so-called Counter-Terrorist Programme Board at Europol, which is a post currently held by a senior officer of the Metropolitan Police. And in any event has been one of the primary architects for the development and the refinement of our police cooperation systems in the EU. So when its status will change, it's axiomatic, I think, that the UK will be in a less direct position to continue to have that influence. And I think that is something that will happen. Also, it's from a UK perspective, again using Europol as an example, over the last 10 years, certainly in the last 2 years, Europol has become the primary channel for how its law enforcement authorities does its operational business with European partners. In the past, and I have some direct experience of managing this work in national agencies here in the UK, it has relied more on its bilateral network of liaison officers in certain capitals. Over time, it has reduced the size of that and increased instead the work that it channels through this multilateral platform at Europol. It does that not least because it saves significant amounts of money for doing it. The 23 British liaison officers currently at Europol today, a very large body of people from 7 different agencies, are rubbing shoulders every day, are doing operational work with 200 other colleagues from 40 countries. It's a unique centre point for how a law enforcement authority does its work. In fact, it's unique. It's unique in the world, and so there is a lot for the UK to lose in those terms. And I already mentioned some references also to the other instruments, I think.